Ray, what's your take on the interview that Netanyahu gave to Dana Bash on CNN? What we've learned from this interview?
Well, the headline caught me on CNN. It said CNN's Dana Bash asks Netanyahu very frontal question, namely, are you not going to take responsibility for the failure to prevent the attack from Hamas on the 7th of October? Well, I thought, wow. So CNN is bragging about holding Netanyahu accountable. And so I not only read the article, but I watched the video. And the long and short of it was that CNN gave Bibi Netanyahu 15 or so minutes to ooze charm from every pore in American English. And as Socrates was accused of, make the worst appear the better. His rhetoric is astounding. He's able, I mean, I would never buy a used car from him, but most Americans would. And that was the long and short of it. Toward the end, she tossed all kinds of softball questions at him, knowing full well how he would explain what is necessary for Israel to do, how there can't be a ceasefire, there must be a release of hostages, and maybe we'll have a pause here and there, but we can't let Hamas do what it's doing. At the end, she said, now, will you accept personal responsibility for the surprise attack? And he said, Dana, I've told you, I've said 16 times already. Of course I will. Of course I will. We will all take responsibility. First, we have to win the war, you know. I don't know if many of your viewers remember back when Sid Caesar was doing comedy, but he had this terrific routine where he dressed up as a Nazi colonel, you know, and he would rant and rave at his troops because if you don't learn the goose step, we won't win the war. Okay, so Netanyahu was saying, if you don't let us do ethnic cleansing before we win the war, we won't win the war. I mean, it was just, I mean, I wish it were funny, but it wasn't. And that's just half of it. You've got the media. As a matter of fact, I was thinking yesterday about Bibi Netanyahu when he wasn't on air, or more correctly, he thought he was on air. Back, what, 2001 it was, he was in this big living room with some constituents, you know, and he was saying, and I've even transcribed it. Let me see if I can recall it. We have to deal the Arabs a chaotic blow. We can't wait for them to strike first. And the woman of the house said, but Mr. Netanyahu, won't they just then call us occupiers? And he says, doesn't matter what they call us. Listen to this. We can have the Americans tell us, please don't do this, please don't do this. Forget about it. It doesn't matter. Listen, 80% of the Americans support us no matter what. That is absurd, says Bibi Netanyahu. That is absurd. So we can do whatever we want. What the Americans say doesn't really matter when we have that kind of support. Now, take what I just said about CNN. You know, listening, if I am a untutored person that has two jobs that I want to find out what's going on, I listen to CNN and I see this totally distorted picture of how Israel has to prevail here to the extent of ethnic cleansing, to the extent of genocide. Now, I'm not making that up. The idea is to drive as many Gazans as they can out of Gaza down into the Sinai. I mean, that's clear. There's a plan developed by Blinken and his Israeli counterparts and think tanks there in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem. What happened when Blinken raised this to al-Sisi, the president of Egypt. I mean, after all, the Sinai is now part of Egypt. Sisi reamed him out that this is crazy. And so did everybody else. King of Jordan, the Turks, the Iranians, all the other Arab leaders, including the Saudis. So where we are here is a very dangerous situation because most Americans believe, for example, that Hamas has tunnels under, let's say, Al-Sifri Hospital, right? Okay. Now, do they? I don't know. What do U.S. spokespeople say? Yes, of course they do. Yes, of course they do. John Kirby for the White House, the defense secretary spokesperson. Oh, yeah, of course they do. And then they're asked for evidence, and they say, well, Jacob Sullivan says, well, it's open source evidence. Oh, so you don't have any people on the ground to verify? No, we don't. The Defense Department spokesperson has asked, well, is this information that you're getting for the Israelis? We have the next question, please. She wouldn't answer the question. Of course they're getting it from the Israelis. Are they lies? Well, I go by the record of previous lies. I have to assume they're lies unless I'm proven. I mean, we have doctors, Norwegian doctors, for example, talking to Al Jazeera and saying, look, I was here the last time, 2014. It's crazy. There are no Hamas. There are no tunnels under here. And the so-called photos, though, when it's used to prove that, first these were a kindergarten or a baby nursery, and the Hamas was torturing people in it. I mean, none of it stands up to close scrutiny. Now, does that matter to the Israeli propaganda machine? No, not one whit, because that won't appear on CNN. And, the old idea about whoever lies first wins. I mean, retraction of lies get no proportion to the response or publication as the lies themselves. So most Americans believe this. The final thing that occurred to me, I came in a podcast, David Sirota. I support him because he's a terrific guy. I mean, support him to the point of subscribing to his podcast. And he was pointing out, and this is really interesting, AIPAC, the Israel lobby, in a word, they are so powerful now and have so much money that they interfere in primary elections in the Democratic Party. So here's a very recent example. Goes back just to August of this year. There's a dynasty in the 9th Congressional District in Michigan. Levins have occupied this. Sandra Levin and now his son Andy Levin. If Levin sounds familiar, well, Senator Carl Levin headed up the Senate Armed Services Committee for a long period of time. He's sort of a dean of the Senate, okay? So you have the Levin family, and the incumbent is running against somebody that AIPAC funds. Now, they're neck and neck up until the August primary, right? Neck and neck, you couldn't really see. And then all of a sudden, this opponent wins by 20 points. How do you explain that? You explain that by millions of AIPAC money going into her coffers. Now, when Andy Levin was asked, well, why'd they do this to you? You're Jewish. You're a very strong supporter of Israel. Andy said, well, yeah, that's true, but I also support the right of the Palestinians to live in a decent land. And I just argue that Israel is far better off in the long term by not having Palestinians oppressed. And so that's not Zionist enough for AIPAC. And so they are they're capable not only of electing and unelecting people in final elections, but they threw me out of contention for my seat in the 9th District of Michigan just because I said those kinds of things, namely that Palestinians are human too. And, it's in Israel's self-interest to meet their demands, to say, look, you have a right to live in a peaceful land. And that was enough to do me in. So why to go through all that? Well, Congress, of course, is much more deeply embedded by AIPAC than the American people at large. The American people only have the lights of Dana Bash and CNN and those people to educate them, so to speak. And I think they're becoming more sensitive, that is, the American people, to how they're being conned, how they're being diddled, there are other words for that. I'll spare that. But Congress, no. Congress is, way ahead of the American people in their undivided, always present support for Israel, no matter what. And so you have not only the administration leaders, Joe Biden in the first instance, and Blinken and Sullivan, all of them Zionists, not to mention Nuland. You have them actually co-belligerents in not only a war against Palestine, but genocide. Well, when I say genocide, I speak advisedly. There are laws against genocide. They're very explicit. Somebody said to me, Ray, has any country ever been convicted or prosecuted for genocide? Yeah. Who was that? Yugoslavia. When? In the late 90s. Oh, did they win? No, Yugoslavia lost 2 times, okay? So genocide is on the books, okay? And it doesn't have to be everybody in an ethnic group. The legislation is very, very careful to say a major part of an ethnic group. So, people who say, well, Israel, the Jews lost 6 million people in the Holocaust. Well, in Gaza, there are 2 million plus 2.3, 2.4, 2.5 million. Well, let's say the Israelis only commit genocide on 2 million. Does it have to be 6 million? That's not just a rhetorical question. The law is very clear. It doesn't have to be all 6 million. It doesn't have to be all Palestinian in Gaza. It just is what's already been done, really. And this business about Hamas hiding on the hospitals. Not even our spokespeople can say that with a straight face. The last guy said, well, in the fog of war, we're thousands of miles away from it. We have nobody on the ground. So, it's the fog of war. Yeah, the fog of war put up by Israeli Hezbollah, the intelligence operations that they run so successfully. And as I say, although Americans are becoming better informed, they're a long way from realizing what's really going on here. One last point. Now, I'm not a lawyer, so I happen to think it my responsibility to ask people who are well-schooled, who are professors of international law. And first and foremost among them is Richard Falk, professor emeritus at Princeton, all kinds of very high UN positions and so forth. He speaks truth to power. And I asked him, now, everyone speaks about Israel's right to defend itself. How about the situation in Gaza, Professor Falk? What about that? Do they have a right to defend themselves while they are occupiers of Gaza? And he said, well, no, they don't. I said, well, a friend of mine said, just like the German Wehrmacht in France, if they went into France, does the German military have the right to defend themselves against the French resistance? He said, no, of course not. He said, it's even worse, Ray, because after World War II, international law developed. And now it's a clear-cut case. A occupier has an obligation to defend the people it's occupying. It doesn't have any right to defend itself against occupied people. That's, of course, what's going on here. So, you never know that from the major media, least of all CNN, I suppose, or MSNBC. But American people need to be sensitized to this. And I think your program, Nima, and others are so popular now that some people are coming around to not only assimilating this factual stuff, but being prompted to say, this is too much. I'm going to tell all my neighbors. I'm going to tell my family. Even at Thanksgiving dinner, I'm going to tell them. If it doesn't work out so well, the justice thing is to tell them, okay? To tell the truth, spread some truth around. Speak truth to those who think they have the power, but really are just slaves of this diddling, of this deception from the mass media, led by the Israeli mass media.
French President Macron gave an interview to BBC in which he calls on Israel to stop killing Gaza's women and babies. How do you see the Europe's policy in Gaza? Are they really serious about what they're talking about, or they just paying a lip service? How do you see their position?
Well, I have to confess to having very little respect for Macron. He's like what's that thing on the airport that shows which way the wind is blowing? A sock, air sock, or whatever they call it. He'll bow, he'll scrape, he'll say things that he doesn't really mean, and he's not really very firmly in power. I would bet right now that he's not going to be around 6 months from now, and I say that because the vassals of the United States in Europe, who speak a good case sometimes, but really do not face down U.S. interests and see them different from European interests, they're going to be gone. And that goes for Scholz in Germany as well. He's very, very clearly losing the support of his people for good reason. And even the Germans are being able to see now that this stuff in Ukraine, this stuff in Gaza is really beyond the pale. They need to stop it. And the way to stop it is to remove governments that are so sheepishly submissive to the United States.
Who's in charge? Who's running the show in Gaza? Is the Netanyahu administration? Is Biden supporting him? Do they have any differences? Because we've heard about the U.S. foreign policy is not the reoccupation of Gaza. How do you see these differences? Is there any difference between them, or behind the scene is all connected together and there is no differences?
Well, Nima, behind the scenes, it's as it usually is. This time, unfortunately, it's right out and open. It's not behind the scenes at all. When October 7th happened, what Bibi Netanyahu had to figure out is how I get the hell out of this situation. There was only one way. Got on the phone and they called Joe Biden. They said, Joe Biden, my best friend, you got to come help me here. Personally, you got to get on a plane, come over here, give me a big hug, tell me everything's going to be all right, and that you will support me for as long as it takes. Can you do that, Joe? Of course. Now, is Biden fully compos mentis? I don't think so. Is he guilty of what our first president, George Washington, called a passionate attachment to the aims of another country, aims that we don't really share if we look at them closely? Yes, he's guilty of this passionate attachment. He has this personal thing. He's misguided with respect to justice, or maybe he just doesn't give a rat's patootie. Anyhow, he went right away and gave Netanyahu the required big hug and said, we're with you, we'll support you. Now, Netanyahu went back to his folks that are not all friendly to him and said, look, You're going to quibble with me now? Look, I've got Joe Biden in my camp. I've got the U.S. media. And guess what? 80% of Americans support me. Isn't that absurd? But it's real. Absurd is the word Netanyahu used. Well, if you trace the workings of AIPAC and how they can dismiss people from office or get them elected, even in primaries, well, you can see that it is absurd, but it's real. So that gave, in my view, that gave Netanyahu a new lease on life. And that was utterly necessary for him because, after all, he was asleep at the switch with respect to the attacks on October 7th. And let's not forget this, if he loses power, he's just as likely to end up in jail. I mean, some of his predecessors ended up in jail. The Israeli judicial system is not all that bad, even though Netanyahu is trying to change it around so he can pick the judge, so to speak. So he's vulnerable in a personal way, and this counts. I mean, history is full of instances where personal stakes have leaned directions in the wrong way. Now, with respect to the eventual outcome in Gaza, I don't think it's possible. I don't think it's even smart to speculate right now. I think the Israelis may well be stopped. I don't think they're going to be able to ethnically cleanse 2 million plus Palestinians out of Gaza. The Egyptians don't want it. Nobody wants it except the Israelis. And when Blinken tried to sell it to the Egyptians, he got the heave ho, really, diplomatically speaking. So I think, and I hope that within the next week or so, there will be a ceasefire. Now, maybe that's an ill-founded hope because of the stakes I just mentioned with respect to Netanyahu. Will they be able to flatten the rest of Gaza? Well, a lot of it. Will they stop? I really don't know. Will Biden feel that American sentiment will change to the point of saying, well, hey, Joe, you lied about those decapitated babies, didn't you? Are you still lying to us about what the Israelis are doing? We have all these photos now. We have all kinds of iPhone and all kinds of things on social media. Are you going to tell us that's fake, Joe? When are you going to stop this? Because you can stop it. Only you can stop it. I like to think that will come into play within the next couple of weeks. Now, that's pretty long. Lots of people can be killed in Gaza during that period of time. But I don't think that Netanyahu is going to be able to pull this one off. I just don't think so. You got Hezbollah in the north. You've got countries like Iran and even Yemen in the south. I think that the two-front war or two-front battles are more likely than a complete Israeli victory, if you will, or retake over of Gaza.
When we look at October 7th, there were a lot of stories about how Hamas killed Israelis, how they reacted. In your opinion, what was the reality of that day?
Well, Nima, there is a defensible argument or theory that Bibi Netanyahu let this happen so that he could do precisely what he's doing now. I don't buy into that. I think he was thoroughly surprised. And partly because he himself was responsible for leaving a very thin defense there on the border with Gaza, having removed troops up to the West Bank and other places. So what I see is him reacting very violently and taking advantage of the opportunity to say, we were attacked, we lost 1,400 people. Whoop, wait a second now. They've downloaded that to 1,200 people. Most people understand who read the alternative media that many of those casualties were done by the Israelis themselves, their Apache helicopters, their tanks, blowing apart these homes where there were hostages, where there were people in captivity as well as Hamas. Okay. So the Israelis are of that kind of mind. They'll do that. And of those 1,200 casualties now, and that's a tragedy, 1,200, and many of those were caused by the Israelis themselves. So what happened? Well, Netanyahu, for his own political and freedom survival, decided, well, he'd take the bull by the horns, and he asked Joe to come, and Joe came right away, and they hugged, and so that's all he needs now. Now, is it possible for the whole world to tolerate ethnic cleansing, genocide? Again, there are laws against genocide. And some countries are going to the International Criminal Court and pressing a case against Netanyahu. The UN is not to be dismissed. The US vetoes these things, even for just a simple ceasefire, and they're tarred with that kind of brush. So there's a lot of international pressure. Whether Netanyahu will come out on his feet is far from clear, and it really depends a lot on how the U.S. feels, how the administration feels about how clear the U.S. populace can be on this information. I think I've said before that in an ironic kind of way, revolutions happen with the latest technology. I'm thinking back to the telegraph in World War One, but you can have to go back. You can go to tape recorders, 70s, Khomeini, Paris, fiery speeches. Khomeini, the Iranian Ayatollah, and those tapes being played from the highest and loudest minarets throughout Iran and Iraq. Okay. And we know what happened. After 2 or 3 months, the Shah was gone. Okay. So that was the latest technology then. What's my point? My point is that we have iPhones. Everyone can take a little picture, and the pictures are real enough. Pictures are indeed worth 1,000 words, and probably 100 videotapes or 100 audio tapes from the 70s. So my view is that if people really continue to agitate for justice here, with hundreds of thousands of people on the streets of every major capital, including Washington, then I think there may be some hope that just as those people prevailed in some circumstances during Vietnam, that we can prevail again, and that these people who are running Biden's foreign policy, Blinken, Nuland, Sullivan, they're not only self-proclaimed Zionists, okay? So again, not only Jews, but Zionists, but they're self-proclaimed indispensable, exceptional people. And they have not yet been disabused of the notion that the U.S. can work its will wherever it wants because we're all powerful. Now, that should have gone by the board decades ago, but it hasn't. And to the degree that they really believe this, how else can you explain their wish to take on China as well as Russia and Ukraine, and now Palestinians in the Middle East? I mean, when President Putin was asked about this, specifically, why do you think those U.S. policymakers are going to take on China now, in addition to the war they have with us in Ukraine? He said, and this is a quote, "I used to think that maybe there was some subtle objective behind this, but I no longer think so. I think they're just crazy. and they're guided by a strong feeling of impunity as well as arrogance. Now, I happen to think that Putin could come to no other conclusion. I mean, now, okay, so they're crazy. Who has their fingers on the nuclear buttons? Well, Blinken maybe, or Biden maybe if he's awake, or will Blinken or Sullivan say, we're losing really bad in Ukraine. We're going to lose the election. And then we're going to lose our freedom because they have the goods against us, all that stuff we did before the election 2020, all that kind of stuff. So maybe, just maybe, we've run out of cluster bombs. We've run out of depleted uranium shells. We don't have any 155 millimeter shell. But we have these little mini nukes. Yeah, let's do that. Let's do a little mini nuke, and that would change the whole equation. And the Americans, people will be proud of us having stifled this evil incarnate Putin. Could they do that? Oh my God, I would not rule it out. Now, can Putin go to his generals and say, oh, come on, they would never do that. Generals look at capabilities, not intentions. And that's the province of military analysis. They go to the political analysts, and what would the political analysts say? We certainly cannot rule it out. They do seem to be crazy as well as arrogant and have this feeling of impunity because the U.S. has never lost a war. These guys don't know what war is like. They've never worn a uniform. Biden got count them, 5 deferments during Vietnam, the same as who else? I guess, didn't Trump have 5? Anyhow, these guys know nothing about war, never had a uniform on, and they have no experience because, thank God, the U.S. has been protected by 2 very large oceans. That's no longer the case. The Russians and the Chinese have some kinds of weaponry that we don't have, namely hypersonic missiles that can be very useful in a theater or a regional scenario. And they would be very happy to use still more of them in Ukraine were they to face a reinforced threat from NATO or from the United States. The war is lost in Ukraine. That's cannot be overemphasized. So what are they going to do? Well, crazy right now is okay, we'll send those 155 millimeter shells for our howitzers and our tanks. We're going to give them to Ukraine, but we'll give them to Israel now. And so, mark my words, Ukraine is out of ammunition. Okay, Ukraine is out of men. Ukraine is out of support in Congress. The Poles and the Slovaks will no longer give military aid to Ukraine. NATO is falling apart. What is Biden going to do about that in an election year? If I were Mr. Putin, I would be worried sick about that because, Biden has this, it's not only indispensable and exceptional attitude. And one reason I believe that he really thinks that way is that he's been caught saying that in private to close friends or people who host the little dinners after he speaks and stuff. He says the same. He's a troglodyte in this kind of sense. So what will you do if he decides, my divine right is to make sure that we don't lose these things, that we support Ukraine for as long as we can, and the worst happens. The worst happens where I would consider the worst that it would be the U.S. tempted to use a small nuclear weapon, not the Russians. The Russians are not losing. They don't have to do something like that. There is no way they can lose. And, in a very hypothetical way, their former president, Medvedev, has said, look, you Americans should pray that we don't lose. Should pray that we don't lose in Ukraine. Why? because then, and only then, would we be prompted to use a nuclear weapon if you started carving off parts of our country. So please pray that we don't lose, because that's what we'll do. Now, that's not some newspaper writer for Sovietskaya Russia. This is the former president who's vice chair of their national security apparatus, Dmitry Medvedev. He's very often the bad cop. We have to listen to what the bad cop says as well as what the good cop says.
What's the reason for the US sending massive weapons, nuclear capable, to the Middle East? Are they seeking a wider war? Are we gonna see some sort of false flag attacks like what we've seen in Syria during Obama?
Well, when you say they, Nima, one has to distinguish who are they, you know? There are people running our policy who very much like to see a war with Iran. They have no military experience. They have not an iota of knowledge about what war is really like. Sort of like Madeleine Albright saying to Colin Powell, yeah, you say you have a great military. Well, why don't you use them? Gotta use them, okay? So there are those people who would just as soon get into a fight with Iran, which would mean a major war. The more so since Iran can decimate Israel now in a couple of minutes. In other words, this is new. Israel is deterred. Iran has so many accurate missiles with no nuclear tips on them, but look at the size of Israel. Every single city in Israel would be vulnerable, and from the north you had thousands of missiles from Hezbollah as well. So a dust up with Iran? Well, if these people are crazy, why not? So Russia, China have to be prepared for this kind of situation, not to mention Iran. Now, would these same kinds of people just as soon see a dust up active hostilities with Russia? Yeah, right. The same people. So that's what we're dealing with. Now, other people, more sensible people, yeah, I really can't mention who they might be because it's a sign of the times. They're all crazy, all right? But some are less crazy than the others. Now, let's say those people say, all right, Secretary Austin, you send 2 aircraft carriers with all those accompanying ships, send them right into the Eastern Mediterranean. Now, their purpose, and this is something that I believe, I haven't checked this out with others, but their purpose might well be to say, look, Netanyahu, Israel, we got you covered, okay? Don't even think of using your nuclear weapons. We know you got between 90 and 200 of them. We know that one of your ministers has said you should use one in Gaza. So just look, relax about it. When worst comes to worst, we're there for you. Leave it to us. Do not even think about using your nuclear weapon, okay? Now, why do I think that could be the case? Well, Austin does know something about war. So do a few others of his generals and admirals. They don't want to get in an active war so many miles from our shores when Ukraine is going on, when we're supposed to be facing a real bad threat in quotation marks from China. So, you know, there are limits to what they want to get involved in. So I could see that this precedent that goes back a couple of decades now, where, and let me just cite this as an analogy. In 1991, we had that great victory over Iraq, right? When Iraq invaded Kuwait, we threw them out. It was shooting ducks there as the Iraqis withdrew. Okay, that was a great win, right? What about how you compare that with now? During that time, Iraq was firing Scud ballistic missiles into Israel. They hit a couple of things. They're not very accurate. They're really, really old things. But we were afraid, that is, U.S. policymakers of more good mind, like George H.W. Bush, said, look, the last thing we need, the last thing we, having assembled this multi-nation coalition, including Arab countries, the last thing we need is for Israel to get involved in attacking Iraq. And so we went all over the place saying, please don't, we got you covered. We got you. We'll find those Scuds. We'll find them and we'll destroy them. But please don't retaliate with what you have. Okay. That worked. Now, as a codicil of this, did we ever find those Scuds? No. We never found them. They were so concealed, and Scott Ritter can talk to this exactly, because he revealed that once we, quote, did find the Scuds, and everybody rejoiced about killing 3 or 4 Scuds, so they were all oil tankers. Scott said so. He was fired. And then when he showed the photos, well, okay, then he was reinstated. That's what kind of guts Scott Ritter had. But anyhow, we could find the Scuds. And Israel knows that, of course. But this time, I think part of the reason for the deployment, not only of those 2 aircraft carrier strike groups, is what they're called now, but that Ohio class missile submarine. Now, those submarines can carry ballistic missiles, really powerful, the latest kind of ballistic missiles, but they can also carry cruise missiles, which are shorter range and can be more useful in that particular theater. So again, if I were an American general, if I were Austin, I would say, for God's sake, don't let the Israelis either get us involved with Iran or with don't let them hit out against Lebanon or Jordan or Egypt or any place like that. Let's reassure them that we got their back, that we're right there. And if worse came to worse and they started to suffer some sort of defeat, we're there for you, Netanyahu. We're there for you. Don't even think of pulling down the whole temple with you with the Samson option. That won't work out well for anybody, least of all you. So I think that's part of the motivation here. I hope so. And it should be a reassurance to Israel that, well, yeah, Biden talks a good game, but here's the military there to deter Hezbollah. And I imagine if I were Hezbollah, I would be somewhat deterred by the power exhibited there. But it's not going to prevent them from doing the kind of small-scale fighting that they're already doing, nor is it going to prevent the terrorist groups. Now, I have to, when we talk about Syria and Iraq, okay? Got to be clear about this. There are there are bad terrorist groups, and then there are moderate terrorist groups. Now, the U.S. supports the moderate terrorist groups, okay? And they train them in a place called Al-Tanf on the eastern border of Syria. And then there are other terrorist groups that help protect the U.S. forces, about 900 of them, up in the north of Syria, where, what are they doing there? Well, President Trump let the cat out of the bag, or said, well, they're stealing the oil. I mean, they're stealing the oil. They still, yeah, that's what they're doing, stealing the oil. So anyhow, there are bad terrorists who don't like the moderate terrorists and are fighting about them with them for 10 years now, and don't like the stealing of Syrian oil either. So what are they doing? They have arms, they have ammunition, they have the wherewithal to make it difficult for U.S. bases to operate in Syria and in Iraq, okay? And so there are about 50 U.S. servicemen who have been not killed, but Some of them are back at Walter Reed Army Hospital. What do they have? Well, some of them have brain injury. Now you can say, oh, brain injury, that'll heal. Brain injury doesn't heal. Okay. I know some brain injured people, okay, from Iraq and from Afghanistan. It doesn't heal. Okay. So now these losses are going to be, they're going to get bigger. They're going to get more in number. And what is the U.S. going to do? They're going to fly those planes off those aircraft carriers? Well, yeah, but I still think that it'll be a kind of a regional kind of thing here. With respect to Iraq, the fruit of our killing 1 million people in Iraq back since 2003 has been that Iraq is now closer to Iran than ever before. Shia mostly, and even Turkey, Shiite. Yeah, Sunni, So you got all the Islamic peoples together here for the first time in a long time. And it's going to come to a no good end, as the Chinese would say, for the U.S. unless they can get Netanyahu to back off. The way not to get him to back off is to repeat Israeli propaganda about Hamas in the tunnels, under the hospitals, and have U.S. and the rest of the world people watching photos of real children being killed, not the made-up children that Biden said had been decapitated, and he had seen the pictures, right? That's how bad it is. So the president of the United States has seen the pictures, right? Where do you get the pictures? Where do you get the pictures? You know where we get the pictures. And so the U.S. is really going to take it on the chin unless we can restrain this unruly, I was going to say ally. It's, Israel is not our ally. And for those who think Israel is, because we say it all the time, you need a mutual defense treaty to be in an alliance. Okay, there is none. And there's a long story behind that, but very briefly, back in 1973, after the Arabs did successfully challenge Israel and had made some gains before the Israelis creamed them, okay, the U.S. administration, Nixon and Kissinger, and Ford, a little later Ford at the time, said, hey, let's offer Israel a mutual defense treaty. That way, no Arab is going to attack Israel ever again. I mean, mutual defense treaty with the United States of America. And so we broached that to the Israelis. And I know that personally, some of my friends were in that initiative. Okay. And what do the Israelis say? Oh, that's so sweet. Oh, that's so nice. Thanks, but no thanks. Turning down a mutual defense treaty with the most powerful country in the world, the United States? Yeah. Why? Because the Israelis like it just the way it is. They don't want to have to ask permission if they're going to go off and hit off after Syria or Iraq or some other country. Okay. That's what you sort of need to do if you have a mutual defense treaty. And they don't want to ask for permission to do that. They'd much rather ask for forgiveness to the extent that's necessary after they do what they want. So it's just fine what they have now. They have Congress. They have the media. They have a president who is personally involved in this notion that Israel is entitled to the land. They have some religious leaders who misread the Bible. Maybe I'll finish with that in this segment at least. I was in the West Bank about 7 years ago. I went up to a little village underneath a alabaster wall city there at the top of the hill, one of the settlers' cities. I was with a small delegation. As we came up the road there, we saw the abject poverty of the Palestinian village at the bottom there. No running water, no nothing, okay? I went up there and And one of my friends, when he asked the rabbi who entertained us or told us how great things were up at the top, he was asked by a friend of mine. A friend says, "Rabbi, you're from where? Where are you from?" "I'm from Cleveland." "Oh, okay, you're from Cleveland." Now I was looking out at the sprinklers out there in that beautiful grass you've got at this little city, and I was remembering down the bottom of the hill there that Palestinians, they don't even have running water to drink. So what do you make about that? And he looked and he said, "Please, God promised us this promised land. This is God." He didn't say this, but in effect, he was saying, "Look, we have this great real estate agent. His name is Yahweh. He gave us this land gratis." And so we pushed the other people. No, he didn't say that. He said, "God promised." And I said, "Where do you get that?" He said, Deuteronomy 15:4. Now, Nima, I haven't memorized the Hebrew Bible to the extent I know the Christian scriptures, but I did know Deuteronomy 15:4 by number. And so I said to this rabbi, "Read us. You got a Bible right there. Read us Deuteronomy 15:4." And he said, "Well, Yahweh said, you shall have a land of milk and honey, and you shall have this promised land." And then I said, "Go ahead, go on." He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "You only read half of it." So he looked at me. "So that there will be no poor among you." "Oh, Rabbi, that sounds like a deal. That sounds like you could call it maybe a covenant. You can have this land so that there shall be no poor among you. What about those people on the bottom of the hill?" Well, suffice it to say, it ended there, not in a very friendly manner, but at least my colleagues and I had a chance to challenge this rabbi from Cleveland about the lack of compassion, lack of justice, really. And I just, what I've learned in my theological studies is that, yeah, Yahweh and Jesus of Nazareth, the prophet, they do care about one thing first and foremost, and that is that we do justice. Okay, that comes first. And last thing here, which I remember from my study of Hebrew scriptures, that the word for justice, pre-Aramaic, so pre the days of Jesus of Nazareth, the word for justice is tzedkah, and it denotes showing mercy to the poor. It's not the connotation. The very word, tzedkah, the word meaning justice in pre-Aramaic language, meant showing mercy to the poor. Now, how far away from that are we now? That goes back several millennia. But we should come back to that because once we abuse the poor, once we give the poor no help, then that's when we have things like not only October 7th of this year, but 9/11 in the United States. I can show that was motivated, that the people who perpetrated that were motivated by what they called U.S. one-sided policy in favor of Israel and at the detriment of the Palestinian peoples. They said that. It's recorded. It's in the 9/11 Commission report.
When you look at these events that have happened in the aftermath of this war in Ukraine, how do you see the future of the US? When you look at Ukraine, when you look at Russia and China, when you look at BRICS, new members of the Middle East, right now, Europeans, their economy is damaged. They're not in a good shape. How do you see the future of US? Is it going to be more isolated? How do you find it?
Well, the supreme irony, Nima, is that the U.S. policymakers say we've isolated Russia. Sanctions, We've accused it of aggression in Ukraine. They were isolated, okay? Now, the truth is that the U.S. has isolated itself together with other lily white people in Europe and Israel. And the distinction is becoming so clear and so dangerous that you have the lily white West represented or personified in NATO and Israel against the rest of the world. Let's face it, the rest of the world. Now, the tectonic shift, of course, is that Russia and China are bound together as never before. Maybe I'll just give you a little history on this. When I started my analyst career at the CIA, I was really lucky because my portfolio was the Sino-Soviet relationship. We called it then the Sino-Soviet conflict or dispute because they were at loggerheads. They were fighting against their riverine border, or they were across from the border. The Chinese were claiming 1.5 square kilometers of Siberia taken under unequal treaties of the 17th century. Is that true? Yeah, it's true. Okay. It was really terrible. They were fighting for leadership what was in the communist world. So I had a really interesting opportunity to write all this down and to tell various policymakers. I was chief of the Soviet foreign policy branch in the early 70s. And I said, look, this is really an interesting situation because China and Russia are so at each other's throats that anyone with a smart mind could take advantage of that. Now, Kissinger and Nixon, whatever you think of them, were smart guys, okay? And, they didn't need McGovern to tell them that, but I did tell them that and received really nice accolades from them. They said, let's see what we do with this. Well, as you know, Kissinger went to Beijing in 1971. Nixon went to Beijing early 1972. At that very time, we and the Russians were negotiating what was called the SALT process, the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks process. Okay, it was very important because neither side wanted to build it to spend itself out of existence. We were building offensive missiles up to kazoo. We were building defensive missiles to defend against the offensive missiles. Sober heads intervened and said, let's work something out. Let's delimit defensive missiles so nobody can think that they could have a first strike and not suffer immediate retaliation. Okay, so we're in those negotiations. I had two people in my Soviet foreign policy branch dedicated to those negotiations. One in Geneva, not Geneva, but Helsinki or Vienna, where the talks took place, and the other in the bowels of the agency with the military folks. Then I had a third writing up for the muckety mucks, and so a third of my branch was involved in SALT, and I got to go to the conclusion of the SALT treaty. Now, why did that work? Well, because Nixon and Kissinger succeeded in frightening the Russians into thinking that, oh my God, there's going to be an alliance between the Chinese and the US to our detriment. There was movement even before the SALT agreements in May of 1972 on Berlin, the sticky wicket, which would never get well. They agreed to a four-power agreement where access to Berlin would be guaranteed. Never before. So we saw the flexibility and we said, yeah, this is working. And so that worked, and they were able to exploit that relationship. Now, we told Kissinger and Nixon at the time, it looks like they're going to hate each other forever. I mean, they have Iridenta, they have, they have this long border. And so until more enlightened leaders come in each country, you'll be able to exploit this forever. Well, guess what? More enlightened show and lie, and lots of folks on our side. So, uh, we can, and that's lots of folks in the Kremlin, I should say. So, this is really debilitating. We're spending so much energy trying to defeat each other. Let's see if we can't tamp down this dispute. And so, what at one time we analysts thought would last forever, they would hate each other forever, turned out to be not the case. And so, gradually, what happened is that especially Vladimir Putin cultivated relationships with the Chinese leaders, Xi Jinping in the last instance, for 20 years, okay? And they've met about 40 times, for God's sake, either personally in the flesh or by Zoom. So now we have a situation where, with the old triangular relationship back in the early 70s, has become if you will, an isosceles triangle with Russia and China, the long sides, and the U.S. literally is the U.S. At the short end of the stick. Okay, and we don't seem to realize that, but that's a tectonic shift. Now, the big indicator that was reality for me, as this old analyst of Sino-Soviet relation, Sino-Russian relation, was February 4, 2022. Putin was up in Beijing. Okay, Ukraine was really percolating. Putin had offered the West to deal with the security situation in Europe. The West said, none of your damn business. We're going to do what we want. We want Ukraine in NATO, and that's what's going to happen. Thank you very much. Now, what did Putin say to Xi Jinping on the 4th of February, 2022? He was there to open the Olympics. He had long since pledged to do that for Xi. Well, my notion, I wasn't a fly on the wall, but I think what happened subsequently is very clear. He said, look, Xi Jinping, my best friend, look, we have a really bad situation in the Donbass in Ukraine. People of ethnic Russian heritage, people who speak Russian, are being shelled so far, 14,000 since the coup in Kiev in February of 2014. I really need to do something about this, the more so because in Poland and Romania already are missile emplacements that could eventually contain missiles that hit Moscow in 5 minutes. Got that? Actually, 5 minutes, okay? So I think I may have to go in and clean out the Donbass, safeguard our Russian ethnic stock, and to the degree we can, defeat the Ukrainian army before it becomes even more of a threat. Now, I know, I know you don't like to invade, people invading other countries or violating borders. I know, Westphalia, I know, but look, I'm just telling you, I think I'm going to have to do that. I'm going to have to do that soon. Now, how did Xi Jinping react? Well, my notion again is that he said, you mean after the Winter Olympics are over, right? Putin said, yeah. The Winter Olympics were over on the 20th of February. On the 21st of February, Putin got up, made a big speech saying we won't tolerate anymore. We're going to recognize Donetsk and Lugansk. And they did. And they signed a mutual defense treaty with both countries. 2 days later, both countries appealed to Russia for help. Next day, the Duma in Moscow approved it, and on the 24th, in went Russian troops. Now, what do I say all that? I say all that because that surprised the hell out of me, you know? All my Chinese specialists said, nah, no, that's sacrosanct. The Chinese would never, ever allow this kind of violation of the Westphalia Accords, okay? Well, they did, okay? They made an exception. As a matter of fact, even their rhetoric for several weeks went away from Westphalia, and they said, each country, when its core interests are involved and an existential threat exists, it's empowered to do what's necessary to defend itself. Whoa, that's not what. So, in other words, the tectonic shift became apparent to me right then, not to the knuckleheads that run policy in Washington, because in June, earlier, they told Putin, hey, this is June 2021. Look, we know that China is a real threat to you, that China is putting pressure on you, that you have to deal with this long border with China. So we know I have this special problem. So do they still think that China will not support Russia? I think they may. They're delusional, but China and Russia are now joined at the hip. They have an accord that's equivalent to a mutual defense treaty, which they say their relationship has no upper limits, okay? And China has shown itself staunchly in support of Russia's position on Ukraine. And of course, Moscow has shown itself staunchly in support of China's attitude on Taiwan. And I think that each leader, and we'll know more this evening after Xi talks to Biden. Well, I think each leader, that is Chinese and Russia, are sort of in wonderment, sort of bemused. Like I quoted Putin before. Are they crazy? Do these Americans really think that driving us, China and Russia together is a good thing? Do they really think that we wouldn't fight to protect one another? And the Chinese are doing some things in the South China Sea now that they've never done before, risking clashes, risking accidents, risking downing B-52 bombers that are going close to Chinese shores. The Americans cutting off Chinese warships. Well, so there's an incident there. I think we should really worry about that. I think the Chinese are less worried. I mean, they look at how far away Hawaii and how far away San Diego are, and they say, so we down a B-52. What are you going to do about it? The Chinese, I firmly believe, are really susceptible to a win-win policy with respect to the U.S. Yeah, they may have a communist government, but they don't want to take over the world anymore. And when we have people in the U.S. Congress that suggest the Chinese are communists, they want to take over the world, and, well, that's just so that they can get more money for their districts to build more ships and planes so that they can stay in office and accumulate still more money. It's a vicious cycle. And never before has the military-industrial complex been shown for what it is. Matter of fact, Biden, when he pleaded for more military aid for Israel and Ukraine, he was so crass in saying, no, this will be money coming to our contractors, our defense contractors. I mean, this is money that we'll be spending in various parts of the United States, and workers, there'll be workers on it. So, and right after that, the Senate Armed Services Committee, to a person, except for one, each one of those senators says, this is money that, we'll spend for Israel and Ukraine, but it's really for really helping our defense industry and people who have jobs in the defense. It was never so crass that that's what they're selling to the American people. Of course, it's spurious. If they spent a slice of that defense appropriation on things like schools, teachers' salaries, police forces, and other things in our country, our borders, then things would be a lot better for Americans. But the fat cats on the top of Lockheed and Raytheon and General Dynamics and Boeing, well, they wouldn't be able to earn $22 million a year anymore. It might be pared back to only 12. That's the problem, folks. And I think that what we need to do is sensitize Americans to the fact that they're being had. There's no reason for these conflicts except to fatten the coffers of what I call the military, industrial, congressional, intelligence, media, academia, think tank complex. They're all in it together. And when I say media, that's because media is the cornerstone. Without the media, you can't make the rest of the Mickey Mat work. And that's where we are. And it wouldn't be so bad had not General Eisenhower, when he left office, warned us precisely this, and saying that the only way we can escape it, the secretion of power, whether desired or not desired by the military-industrial complex, the only way we can prevent it is by an enlightened, a well-educated citizenry. That's where the media comes in. They're keeping most of us fellow Americans in the dark about who's really profiteering on this and how completely unnecessary it is to challenge China. I had a little thing that maybe I'll see if yeah, here it is. There's in U.S. culture, there's something called a Western movie. Most countries abroad know about the Western movie, and very often these Westerns have a guy who comes into town, right? And he says, "This town ain't big enough for both of us." Now that has spilled over into foreign policy, and it's a neat summation of Washington's attitude toward Beijing, towards China. The Pacific Ocean ain't big enough for both of us. I mean, suppose the Chinese challenged us in the Caribbean and said, and then we would say, well, the Caribbean, it ain't big enough with the Pacific Ocean. Okay. And if you know how Westerns sometimes turn out, the suggestion here, instead of inviting the other guy for a drink at the Long Branch bar and a long talk, you're going to build more missiles, more submarines, more naval vessels, more of everything. For what? So that we can prove that this town or this ocean, in the case of the Pacific, ain't big enough for both of us. And I just append to that a comment made by Joe Biden himself. He was visiting a southern city after a hurricane, and the mayor of the city came up and said, "Now, Mr. Biden, what you've been doing on Ukraine and other that's just really terrific, And he said, I'm not going to use the word because it begins with F, but you could figure out what it means. He says, yeah, he says, nobody F's with a Biden. What kind of mentality is that? That may have worked after World War II. It may even have worked after the Soviet Union imploded, but doesn't. Okay. And again, with respect to China, about 8 weeks after Biden took office, in a major speech, he said, and this is a virtual quote, China aspires to be not only the most powerful economic country in the world, but the most powerful country in the whole world overall. That's not going to happen on my watch. His words. That's not gonna. Now, I listened to that, watched it. I said, "Why not, Joe? Why not live and let live? Why not win-win? There's enough in the world for us to share. We ain't used to that. Biden's of the old school. I don't think he's going to change. I don't know what it's going to take for him to realize that ain't the case any longer. Blinken, Sullivan seem to think the same. Nuland the same. When somebody asked me, "Well, how about wise men? You know, how about some adults in the room?" I looked around and there aren't any. There aren't any. Not even the media. There aren't the people that were around during Vietnam, for example, where LBJ, when he finally saw all was lost, to convene them. All right, now tell me the truth. We're not going to win, right? No, we've already lost. Okay, so what we do? Well, we're not going to give Westmoreland, General Westmoreland, the 210,000 extra troops you want. That's for sure. Okay, we won't do that. Okay. Well, what else? Well, you know, I don't think you should run for re-election, Mr. Johnson, LBJ. Well, yeah, doesn't look okay. I will announce I'm not going to run for re-election. I'm going to go into a bombing pause. We're going to talk about this, and I'm not going to let Westmoreland go up into North Vietnam and fool around with nuclear weapons. That happened. That happened in March of 1968, after that major Tet offensive, which showed who was winning, who had the more troops, how Westmoreland had been lying through his teeth. Now, is Biden up to recognizing how he's been lied through his teeth? How when he was told to say Russia has lost this in Ukraine, how when his head of the CIA, William Burns, supposedly a adult in the room, said not only, "Oh yeah, Russia has lost," but the ineptitude, the failure of the Russian military forces has been laid bare for the whole world to see. I mean, hello, those are the adults in the room now. Maybe it's just people like us, Nima, and people who listen to us and realize we have to get off our derrieres now, make our opinions felt, educate our fellow citizens, because if these numbskulls, these people who are advising Biden, have a personal stake in not losing in Ukraine, helping Netanyahu to the nth degree, and thereby not losing the election and not losing their freedom, the evidence is in court against these people. There's lots to put not only Hunter Biden, but Daddy, Blinken, Sullivan, who was responsible for Russiagate. They've all violated the law. They have to worry. You know, there is that orange-haired guy waiting in the wings, right? Is he going to be nice if he wins? Looks like he might win now. Is he going to be vengeful? You know, if he's vengeful, well, he's got the book on these guys. They're going to end up in jail. That's how volatile the situation is. Now, does that worry me? Yeah. Does that worry Vladimir Putin? My God, of course it does. And that's why he's been so perspicacious, in my view, how he's been so gradual. How even in Ukraine, where he could even now just rush to the Dnieper River, he's doing a little bit, he's treading and not giving anyone any reason to up the ante. The ante is being chipped away here, and in another month or so, the Ukrainian forces will not have anybody left to man their foxholes, okay? And they won't have any more 155 millimeter shells to put in their howitzers or their tanks. The few that were going to be given to them are now in Israel. I mean, it's a really bad situation for Zelensky. Looks like he's not long for this world. As I told one other interviewer, I think if I were an insurance agency, I certainly wouldn't sell Volodymyr Zelensky any more life insurance. I think he's really not long for this world. The only way they can really get rid of him is the usual way, what happened to Ngo Dinh Diem in Vietnam. Otherwise, he knows too much. Otherwise, he's too vindictive. You can't trust him to keep his mouth shut. There's too much at stake. So take care, Zelensky, and if it's delusional Zelensky, well, that's not going to be much better. This thing's got to work itself out, and it's hard for me to see right now how the Biden administration can escape this terrible situation without the voters really appreciating what a disaster it has been, and how much of our billions of money could have been devoted to worthwhile social causes other than feeding defense contractors so that they can make $22 million a year, rather than, and stock options, of course, rather than just 12. What do people do with their extra millions, I wonder? Neiman, maybe you know what people do with their second or third or fourth million. It just befuddles me. It's not part of my world. If I were a little younger, I would be probably in jail after demonstrating. So those of you who don't have this kind of hair and don't have a wife to take care of, please assimilate this stuff and then decide, is there something you can do? I mean, there's some action you can take. Because as my old idol, Cesar Chavez of the United Farm Workers used to say, without action, nothing's going to happen.